Hi, welcome back to the People Data for Good podcast. I'm Al Adamsen, and I just had a fantastic conversation with Brad Williams. He heads HR technology and people analytics at Northwestern Mutual. He also formerly worked at HP and Sears, so he's been in the space for quite a number of years, not only doing people analytics and HR tech, but also workforce planning. So he has a very clear narrative of how those both work together. We also talked about his educational background in psychology and how that influences thinking in not only doing analytics, but how to engage with stakeholders and prioritize. He also shared some tidbits about himself along the way. So really enjoyed my conversation. Hope you enjoy the conversation with Brad. And here you go. Thanks for being here. Welcome back. I'm here with Brad Williams. Brad, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Great to be here, Al.
It's great to be talking with you finally. We've gone through some start and stops, both technologically and on the calendars, but this is a conversation that I've wanted to have for a long time because you obviously have been in the space for many years, but you've also done both workforce analytics and workforce planning. And now you're leading HR technology at Northwestern Mutual. So if you would introduce yourself a bit and what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, so Brad Williams, I head up our HR technology and people analytics teams at Northwestern Mutual. I've been there a little over 2 years now. I joined at an odd time in our world history here, shortly after the pandemic started, so May of 2020, and have been leading those teams since.
Well, I mean, when we first talked, I was really taken aback by you going deep into the technology side, also the analytics side, but also the planning side. And so, before we get into like the work, I'd love to hear about how you got into the space. I mean, your educational background and your inspirations for doing so. So if you would share a little bit about, how that happened.
Yeah, no, I would love to, and I'll try to, not be too verbose here because I could probably spend a good 4 or 5 hours talking about just me, my background, and what got me here. Because as you can imagine, it's full of twists and turns, and fate or luck along the way. So, growing up, the first thing that I remember I wanted to be was an architect. There was a lot of appeal about, I think, building things, designing things, seeing your work out there in the world. One of the maybe more traumatic events of my childhood that I think shaped me, although, you don't really realize it shapes you in the moment. In high school, my older brother, who was 2 years older than me, got into a pretty serious car accident, had a traumatic brain injury. He was in a coma for a couple of days, came out just fine, but had a long road of recovery, more so on the mental side than the physical side. He had a couple of broken bones, but those heal a lot quicker than mentally. And I was really interested in seeing how his personality, his mindset changed, and it got me interested in how people think, how people behave, why some people do the things that they do, or two people can look at the exact same event and walk away with very different interpretations, understandings. And so in the moment, I don't think I was consciously aware of the draw to psychology, but I for the next couple of years kind of passionately pursued architecture, but ended up, when I went to school at the University of Tennessee, I went in undecided. And after taking a psychology class as part of first year, I really had a draw towards that. And so without, being a perhaps naive 18, 19-year-old kid, I realized I didn't really think about what I wanted to do with a psychology degree. It was just interesting. I wanted to learn more about it, and I declared it my major. So I've always been drawn to the psychological side of human behavior, But all the while, I've had I think, natural ability and an interest in data, analytics, numbers. And so over time, I really kind of stumbled into the world of HR analytics. And my first, you know, gig outside of grad school was at a small healthcare company. I was I guess the lone recruiter in-house there. But I was really attracted, so that got me into HR. But I was really attracted to the data behind it. Where can you find the best candidates? How long does it take you to fill positions? How many interviews should you do? And it was really kind of foundational level data and analytics that attracted me to it. And then through networking, I stumbled on what I would consider my first kind of true HR data analytics planning role. And that was with Sears up just north of Chicago as part of their people analytics team, or I think they were HR analytics at the time. And absolutely loved that gig. I think most of us probably are familiar with the history of Sears and, kind of the curvature that they went on from being a very dominant company in the 80s and 90s to where they were when I joined them. But they put a lot of investment emphasis on data, on analytics, and particularly in the HR space. And so that grew my, I guess, interest, my love, my passion for analytics. But I knew, candidly, Sears wasn't the long-term solution for me, or the place I wanted to be long-term, just given some of the challenges that they had as an organization. So I moved over to a tangent role, as I think of it, to your point, on the workforce planning side. So I moved over to Hewlett Packard doing workforce planning, which applies, I think, a lot of the same principles. There's a lot of synergy, as to use the fun corporate buzzword there, between the HR analytics world and the world of workforce planning. And oftentimes they go hand in hand in a lot of organizations. But really discovered what workforce planning was. I didn't go into that role with a full appreciation or even a real foundational level understanding of what workforce planning is, why it was important, what its mission was, what value it could bring to the organization. It was really just this sounds like a great opportunity. It leverages a lot of the skills that I have. It aligns well with my interests. So I took it, absolutely loved it, and developed a passion for that side of the house, as I think of it, on workforce planning, and really understanding how you can use a lot of the data that you've got available to you to set plans for your workforce, to connect into finance, to understand how salaries and labor costs can align with talent strategies, and all have it make sense so that you're in the best position for not only where you are now as an organization, but where you are going to be, 3, 5, 10 years down the road. And so one of the interesting things with Hewlett Packard during my time there was, and I suppose this isn't unique for Hewlett Packard, but they went through a ton of M&A activity. And so shortly after I was there, maybe a year and a half into my time there, they announced they were splitting into 2 different companies. They were going on HP Inc., Hewlett Packard Enterprise. One of the exciting things for me in workforce planning and the business unit that I supported, it was the corporate functions. So it was really the function that didn't align neatly to one side of the house or the other. So it involved heavy workforce planning to kind of divide that workforce into those 2 different organizations, make sure that each side of the house, each new company was going to have the talent fit within the cost envelope. And all the while, it's a dynamic, moving target, because people are coming and going throughout. So you don't ever have this static snapshot of people that are here, people that will always be here, and how to divide them. You're constantly having to make adjustments and adjust on the fly. So we did a couple. Yeah.
Let me jump in there, if I may, because I am just, I'm smiling. And if you're listening to this, you don't see my smile, obviously, but it is the case where, here you are in Rocky Top, you're studying psychology, and all of a sudden you're, a few years later, you're at Sears. And for those who don't know, Sears was a pioneer in what we're now calling people analytics. You go back to the Sears surface profit chain, they're validating at that time in the late 90s employee satisfaction connection to customer satisfaction, and in turn, financial outcomes. And HP, same time during the 90s, was one of the pioneers in mitigate or calculating the risk of turnover. And so again, these are very cutting edge companies that you're entering into. So the platform for learning that you're getting very early on in your career is just, it's phenomenal. So, I just want to call that out and, celebrate it. So, from, you're about to say at that stage at HP or HPE, I don't know what side of the house you went, you're doing some interesting projects that led you to where you are today. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. And maybe real quick to go back to Sears and HP and what you just called out, you're exactly right. Being that early on in my career, I didn't have an appreciation for the level of sophistication or how far ahead they were in really trying to understand that space and really kind of evolve and be pioneers, as you put it. I went into those roles and just, thought, well, this is how every company operates. This is par for the course. And it's only been in, further in my career and talking with others in the space that I've grown to even partially appreciate what great opportunities those were that candidly, again, I think luck, fate, whatever you want to call it, really helped shape my career where I am today. So those are things that I appreciate you calling out, because I certainly wouldn't be where I am without some of those early experiences that at the time I absolutely loved, but felt very mundane and ordinary and, par for the course. I didn't realize how great of opportunities they truly were until, a decade later or so. So,
Right.
At NM, we're in the middle of a transformation, and I always hesitate to say that because every company that I've been at so far has been in the middle of some transformation. So it comes across as cliche, but I really think that there's a lot of exciting opportunities that are going on at Northwestern Mutual. And one of the things that I think makes it a great place to work. The pandemic has really impacted Northwestern Mutual. And I think that's true of a lot of organizations and companies. But, historically, NM has been a very, on-campus workforce, a lot of networking, a lot of in-person meetings, a lot of it's been a very tight-knit interpersonal community and company. And as a result of the pandemic, them, along with a lot of companies, had to adjust to how do we work in a more hybrid world? How do we kind of expand some of the talent pools that we know we need for the future if we want to keep up and keep ahead of some of our competition, some of our competitors. So a lot of investment in the technology space and the platforms that our clients use and our field advisors rely on. And so that's been a lot of the work that we've done, certainly in my 2.5 years there, but, it preceded me as well. And how do we enable that? How do we understand what's the workforce of the future look like for NM? How do we make sure that we're getting the talent in the door? And so there's a lot of fun things that are going on. It doesn't always feel fun. I hesitate to say that word because there's deadlines, there's deliverables, as there are with all things, which at times don't always feel like the most fun thing. But a lot of them are really core to what I would say are HR analytics. It's, I don't want to position that as it's not groundbreaking stuff, because it is in the sense of how we're tackling it and what we're looking at and what it means for NM. But it's a lot of, data, metrics, analysis on recruiting. Where do good candidates come from? What's our internal to external mix look like when we're going out and hiring people? A lot of, deep dives on attrition, as you can imagine. And I know most of your listeners will appreciate the external labor market that's out there and the war on talent, or whatever you want to call it, and how competitive that is. And so there's a ton of focus, a ton of emphasis, a ton of data swirling around, a ton of analysis, a ton of insight on kind of the core principles or the core metrics of HR, but really just diving deep into understanding what that looks like and how best we can leverage that to make good decisions for the future of NM and the talent that we've got.
Well, with that as the staging, tell me and our listeners your thoughts around the importance of aligning HR technology with people data and analytics and designing for the future of work, whether that be workforce planning or whatever the language is that you're using there at M&M. Because, and I'll preface this by saying this, is that many organizations have it be two different people, two different functions, and there's often, disalignment. So there's obviously value in that, alignment and bringing it within one group and one leader. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I've got my personal opinions here, and maybe I'll let those come to light here a little bit. But during my time at NM, I suppose I glossed over this fact. When I joined NM, my remit was workforce planning and people analytics. HR technology was handled separately. And about a year into my tenure there was, we moved the pieces around. My boss, I've worked with him at a couple of different stops, is one to rearrange the deck chairs from time to time. And so my remit changed and I took on HR technology, and I transitioned workforce planning over to another member of our leadership team. And I really have become a firm believer in having the technology and the data together. Again, I don't know how much I truly appreciated it before that decision came to light, or before that's the course that we were set on. But I absolutely believe that those two things should, at the very least, be, hand in hand and partner together, because there's so many impacts and collaboration opportunities that technology will do that if data and the analytics side of the house aren't involved in, or don't understand, or aren't brought into some of those conversations, there's all sorts of impacts. And it goes both ways too. And so, one of the things that I'm constantly asking my team is, and I'm reading myself, what are other people analytics, HR analytics, talent analytics teams measuring? What metrics are they looking at? What types of analysis are they doing? And I think there's great opportunity in the synergy of analytics and technology to help shape that, because oftentimes my experience has been on the analytics side of the house, I read something and I'm like, it would be great if we could measure that. We should do exactly what they're doing. But from a technology standpoint, we're not collecting that data. There's no infrastructure to get any of that insight so that the analytics team can leverage it, look at it, and run analytics on it. And I think that's where there's a lot of opportunity is, not just understanding how things work today, but what does the future look like? What are things that we want to measure? If we really wanted to look at, employee productivity, for example, how would we measure it? Let's not limit ourselves to the data that we have available today, which is always going to be a constraint. But really, how do we collect the information that we need from a technology standpoint so that we can do some of the analytics? So I strongly, and my stance has grown even stronger over my time here, that those two things bring a whole lot of value when they're brought together.
Well, Brad, you and I had fun with this before, and I'm going to take some risk and do this right here, right now. You ready?
Yeah,
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This is, I throw that in there because I could hug you for saying what you just said. It is massively important, and I think it's not truly understood. If you are just a people analytics professional who has a background in analytics or data science and doesn't understand HR technology, there's that blind spot. On the other side, if you're in HR technology and say, well, just go do your analytics over there, and to understand the relationship between the two at scale over time is absolutely critical. So I want to celebrate that. And you also highlighted something for me that I want to get your take on, because you said employees, and I have long put forth that people analytics, the way it's evolved over the years, has largely focused on the existing workforce, whereas workforce planning is looking at not only the existing workforce, but relative to labor markets or talent markets. And is that part of the distinction that you made in uncoupling those there at NM?
Yeah, so I think there is a lot of that there. I think, one of the things, and maybe this gives a peek behind the curtain here a little bit, in the transition that we had within NM on the workforce planning space, and how do you carve out people analytics from workforce planning? Because in a lot of organizations, those are under the same umbrella, part of the same team, because similar to technology, there's a whole lot of synergy, collaboration. And I think that's where me and my peer who heads up workforce planning at NM have really made that distinction of, when we're looking at the here, the now, the historical, and really understanding what we've got, the employee base, that is firmly kind of people analytics, and where the remit falls on my side of the house. Whereas when we start to think about the future and forward-looking projections and what our needs are and where attrition's headed, and the external labor market and where the best talent pools are for certain skills or roles that we need for the future, that is firmly in the workforce planning side of the house. So I do think the long-winded answer to your question there is, I do think that that's how I think of it. Again, you need to partner together, you need to work together, you really need to be tied at the hip to make all of that make sense and tell a coherent story and provide the value that it's intended to have. But that's, I suppose, how I kind of think of it there.
Well, again, I'm not going to do the clapping machine again, but what I am going to call out, and I think you did a great job describing it, is there's a lot of work there. There's a lot of value to be had, certainly, but historically, CHROs and executives in general have not grown up with people analytics in 2022 or workforce planning in 2022. And there's a lot of technologies, there's a lot of work to do to generate the insight to make good decisions, at speed, at scale, and in sustainable ways. So no, I celebrate the way you're not only have thought about it, but how you've allocated the work and put someone in charge of, these different aspects. So where are you today? And I ask this question all the time. And so if you listen to my podcast in the past, you probably know what's coming, is that this nature of governance, who, for the sake, who are we serving? And, who is helping you prioritize and set your, research agenda or project, agenda, for your work. So can you speak to, who your audience is? Does it stay within HR and go up to, the HR leadership team? Do you have a broader audience for the insights that you're generating? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I don't think there's one answer here. I think this is it's one of the things that I'm passionate about. Is I firmly believe in the power of data, the power of analytics, the insights that it can provide. I also, out of the other side of my mouth, caution that it's never the silver bullet. It's not going to give you all the answers. It's not going to tell you everything. In fact, as I think of it, I read this yesterday, people analytics is a lot more impactful and effective when it leads to conversations, not necessarily when it leads directly to action. And I think that sometimes gets lost in people just want the answer. People just want to know like what to do. So, read this data and tell me what I should do based on it, rather than maybe stirring some of the conversation. But to get back to your question, I think it really is. There's no one size fits all. From my perspective here at NM, I think of our audience as I suppose different segments, but we're meant to kind of serve all of them. And I think there's employees at large, there's people leaders, there's, employees internal to HR, all with their different needs, perspectives, certainly depending on what their remit is and all the different COEs. But then I do think it's kind of core to make sure you're managing up, you're meeting the needs of your executive members, and even your boss's expectations. But I'm never one to really solely work up. I really like to work across and work down and understand where the needs are, how best to serve the greatest number of individuals that we've got. And so my passion is really around partnering with anybody, everybody, as much as possible to really understand what their needs are, what their challenges are, what they're struggling with, what questions they have, so that we can take all of that and figure out, what's maybe unique to that individual or that persona or that group of individuals, and maybe tailor things for them. But then also what's maybe common? What are those questions or challenges that seem to be taking place regardless of where you sit in the organization, or whether you're an employee, individual contributor, or whether you're a people manager, or whether you're, an executive, and really start to shape your roadmap and your products and your analytics based on all those different data points, and kind of weighing them in some, crazy algorithm in your head to make sense, and kind of put your effort based on those conversations and that feedback that you're hearing.
With that in mind, do you do that in a systematic way on a recurring basis, or do you do that kind of ad hoc? Not that there's a right and wrong answer. It's just the idea of prioritization. The challenge of prioritization is something that everyone's trying to crack the nut on, because the more value you deliver, correct me if I'm wrong, the appetite increases. Yeah. It's like, oh, do that. No, there's actually work there, and I know in our previous discussion you're talking about building tools so there's sustainable value being generated. But yeah, can you go back to that initial question? Do you have a systematic approach to prioritization, or is it just based on your informal conversations with your key stakeholders?
Yeah, you may be outing me a little bit on this one, Al, because I really want to say, just naturally, I've got this great method, this great system, and here's the checklist that I follow, and here's the criteria and how I weigh certain pieces. But the reality is, I'd be lying to you if I said that. I do think it is a lot more, as my bosses wanted to say, a lot more art than science to how to weigh all of those different things and how to go out and seek it. And I think that's one of the things too that, I'm a lot more, I try to be really intentional and really proactive in seeking feedback when there's maybe more of a lull and I'm never really sitting on my hands waiting for work to come in, but where there's maybe less work going on in the system, less demand, to be really intentional to go out and connect with stakeholders, connect with employees, people leaders, and understand things from their perspective to shape some of that. Whereas, when demand seems to be crushing a little bit, I'm a whole lot less proactive in asking people what more they want, because to your point, it's just going to add to the workload. But I tell my team that it's a really good problem to have, and it sounds maybe disingenuous to some degree, and it's full of challenges, but that demand and that sense that maybe we're too stressed or too stretched with the work that's coming at us is a really good problem to have, because it shows the value that we're bringing and the appetite that we've got. And by its nature, I think it forces us to prioritize. And I rarely prioritize in a silo by myself, where I look at a 1 through N list and I go, this is the top 3 things that we're going to do. It's a very collaborative effort with my team, with our stakeholders, and there's tough conversations, there's puts and takes, there's things that don't always make people happy when their things aren't right at the top of the list. But I think that's where, when you're going out, when you're having those conversations and building those relationships, you build those connections that give people the confidence and the insight that you are making the right decisions in the interest of the broader organization. It may not be in their own best interest, but I think you get, perhaps some brownie points for doing that. So I think it serves multiple purposes there.
Well, yeah, just for the record, I'm not trying to call you out. In fact, quite the opposite. I want to celebrate what you're doing, because there's been many leaders, many organizations that have hired a data scientist, people with PhDs and the like, and they don't work out. And it invites the question, what the heck's going on? They are obviously great at data and analytics and might even be, great technologists, but they don't have the relationship equity. They don't have the ability to activate the insight that they're generating. And frankly, going back in my career, it was something that I kind of learned the hard way, quite frankly. So I want to just call out that your ability not only to have the technical and analytical chops, but the relationship chops, if you will, to make that happen. And correct me if I'm wrong too, and it was embedded in what you just shared, you're creating anticipation for what is forthcoming. So you're not just going into this black box and pulling out magic with a big aha. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely fair. I don't want to say I've never, pulled a rabbit out of a hat and said, here you go. Nobody asked for this. Nobody was talking about this. Here you go. And surprise people. I think there's, fun in doing that. Oftentimes, I don't know that it works out as well as you think it does. But I do believe in bringing people along and helping kind of understand what you're doing, what questions you're trying to answer based on some of the things that you're hearing, based on some of the things that they're saying. My favorite quote, and I say it, my team is probably so sick of me saying this, because, in 90% of the team meetings that I have, I pull this quote out by Henry Ford of, if I asked the customer what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And I really, as much as I love that quote, I also, scale it back a little bit where sometimes our customers, our stakeholders really just want a bicycle. So we don't need to go off and build a car and kind of surprise them with this great innovative thing that they might not need. Sometimes, like, don't get me wrong, surprises can be great and exceeding people's expectations and really producing a car when they had a faster horse in mind can be phenomenal. But I've found, maybe similar to your experience as well, that in bringing people along, you kind of are better able to truly meet their needs and still, surpass their expectations from time to time, but really hit the bullseye a lot more frequently than you otherwise would. And that's not to say, I'm shooting 100% in that arena by any means. You're gonna take swings, you're gonna miss, you're not gonna hit the nail on the head every single time. I think that's part of the learning journey that everybody in this profession goes through, but it's really, how do you adapt? How do you adjust? How do you continuously take that feedback so that you're always getting incrementally better, a little bit closer to what is truly needed out there? And also, you're taking your own perspective. I try to balance, because I don't want, I guess my advice to myself, to my team, and, perhaps to your listeners here is, don't lose sight over yourself either. Don't be so subservient to your customers and your partners and your stakeholders to whatever they want. You're in that position for a reason, and you should be shaping, some of those products, some of those tools, some of those experiences just as much. The talk track, I suppose, is, don't do that in a silo. Make sure you're kind of equal partners, bringing people along and sharing your perspective, your expertise along the way, versus some of those surprises or ahas.
Well, I love what you're sharing, and what I want to do now. Yeah, well, actually, I'm going to say something first about what you just shared, because you're humanizing this work. When people hear analytics, they often get defensive. It's like, oh, someone's coming in the room to sound smart and I don't understand it. Therefore, I'm going to be on my heels. And I love that you make it very approachable and very kind of co-creation, joint ownership, if you will. So I just want to call that out and celebrate it. So in the balance of their time, I would love to do three things. I would love to talk about some specific projects that you're working on. And I'd like to talk about the future a bit, because obviously here we are coming up in the fall of 2022, and we're in this, what I'll call, age of perpetual disruption. And you referred to it earlier. So, what's the future of our discipline in people analytics? And last thing, I have some rapid fire questions that I'd like to wrap up with. But so, specific projects, there's so much we can do. And again, you touched on some of those. What's top of mind for you right now? What's getting you excited and drawing your energy?
Yeah, so I think there's maybe two things. And, again, part of this goes back to what I mentioned earlier, where I don't know that I think a lot of people are always looking for the next best thing and the next great analysis, and you can lose sight over some of the basics and some of the things that people really want. And I'd be lying to you if I told you I'm equally excited about that stuff as I am about the new innovative stuff that's out there that's maybe a little bit more untapped. But I still get really jazzed and really excited about some of the, what I think of as kind of core metrics, and diving deep into them and really understanding and understanding it in the context of this organization, this team. And so, there's a couple of things that we're looking at there. So I'll give two answers, and then maybe one that's a little bit more on the horizon. But, I can't get away from attrition. I don't know that many of us can, especially this day of age. So there's a lot of work going on in just understanding that and what steps we can do to be a little bit more proactive on the retention front and understand, when people are vulnerable to leave, what we can do to prevent it, I always kind of talk that back a little bit because I don't want zero attrition, and I don't want anybody under the impression that we should have zero attrition. There's a healthy amount. So how do we make sure that we're finding that healthy amount? And there's a lot of work going on in understanding that. And then the second thing that's going on is really around some of the internal movement that we have here at NM, and how do we best share talent and move people into opportunities that maybe aren't right in front of them. And while we're a Fortune 100 company, from an employee standpoint, we're not a huge organization, but we still have our challenges in being a little bit siloed in our talent, and people, really just being aware or exposed to the opportunities that are maybe right next to them or right above them, and not, on this other department, this other function way over there where their skills could be just as applicable. And so it's really understanding, how do we set up that ecosystem, and how do we use data to inform some of those journeys that people have and some of the opportunities that they could be exposed to. And that's where, again, to plug back my earlier comment, there's huge synergy and huge opportunities on the technology side and the data and analytics side, and where you really see those things come together to design and create optimal solution for doing that. And then, the forward-looking one that's maybe a little bit more on the horizon that we haven't dug too deep into just yet, but I wish we would have. It's just a matter of priorities and capacity and things. But it's really around just I think the burnout and the connectivity that people have, and attempting to understand what's really behind that, what's driving that. I think, again, NM's not immune to the fact that people feel a little bit isolated or maybe disconnected, and there's a sense of burnout, especially, working from home, and, your hours never really come to an end. You're always expected to be connected. And so what are some of the data points that we can look into to really understand that and provide recommendations, solutions to the best of our ability, curb that as much as possible. So some early work going on there to really understand that. And I think that will be a theme in 2023 as well.
So just to go deeper into that, if you just to summarize: attrition, internal mobility, and burnout and well-being. And so all of that would take the, call it, behavioral data that you might be using, the core HR data, survey data, potentially qualitative data that you gather through interviews or focus groups or what have you. So that would take a systematic approach, someone with your skill set to think, how are we going to actually analyze this, over time. And it also, correct me if I'm wrong, has impacts on diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as learning, because there's data that you're capturing underneath there. So what I want to ask pointedly is, you have all these projects, and I've seen many an organization have those be disparate projects and not looking at the overlapping nature of that. Is that part of what you do, is connect these dots to see how, what one initiative does to another?
Yes, that's absolutely true. And it's, I think one of the things you brought up, a great example, and it's it's not just huge at NM. I think it's a point of emphasis and a priority for a lot of organizations, and understandably and rightfully so, on the DE&I front. And what we're really trying to do is shift from a more I don't know the right way to say this, but a bit more of a programmatic DE&I perspective, to really embedding that in everything that we're doing, and break down some of the channels that exist and really understand things more holistically. Like to your point of, if we look at just, TA or selection or, the onboarding experience, that's well and good, and there's a lot to dig into there. There's a lot to understand. But if you're ignoring all of these other lenses around learning, around DE&I, around engagement and retention, you're missing a lot of the story, a lot of the narrative. And so I do think that is one of those things that you can never emphasize enough, is how does all of this connect together? And I my opinion is it's really challenging for people, myself included, to really understand that and wrap their head around it and not think of things in a programmatic, siloed way. And so I think that's a constant battle that I have with myself. And I know in kind of talking through with stakeholders, with partners, and sharing out insights, it's one of those things that I do my best, and I have my shortcomings, but do my best to really make sure that that's top of mind and apparent in the work that's being done, and not just here's one piece of analysis as a standalone piece, but how does this connect to the bigger challenge, the broader narrative?
This is so important. Such a, thank you for sharing that, because not many people can do that. And oftentimes I hear, "Oh, it's too complex. Just stay in your lane." And like, no, time out. We have to celebrate the complexity sometimes. And I think this is certainly time to do it. And in that regard, there's one topic that I want to touch on, because we can talk about use cases and projects all day. I realize that. But one thing that's happening in our space is, when you talk about technology selection. So just to recap, you're also leading HR technology and analytics. The technologies that you select impact the data and measurements that will be created, which in turn will impact the analytics that you can or cannot do. Is that something that is top of mind always as you look to improve your technology and the ecosystem of technologies within HR and potentially out?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of those things that, can't be understated or can't be overstated enough, is how and where can you, I think, supplement your own data analytics with technology. Because again, to the earlier discussion that we had, there's a lot of demand out there, and teams that are moving up the maturity curve in the analytics space are no doubt dealing with more and more demand, and capacity doesn't, at least in my experience, grow at the pace that demand does. And from a technology perspective, I think that's where there's a lot of value to supplement the analytics space, to understand what analytics, what insights can be provided by this technology, so that there's less demand on the people analytics team to do other things. And I think that's constantly one of those evaluative pieces to really make sure that we're choosing the best technology, we're integrating the best technology into our tech stack that helps out there. It doesn't mean it's the only criteria. It doesn't mean that's the deciding factor in all of it, but it is something that I weigh, because again, I'm constantly dealing with the demand and capacity, and how can we make sure that we're striking that right balance, and technology can certainly help there.
Yeah, and that's a whole discussion that we could have as well. And but it's certainly, we have to remain, as people and leaders, educated consumers of what's out there, what innovations are happening. So, and I know that that's something that you do. I want to sneak in this question, and it is yet another topic that we can spend all afternoon talking about. And it's one of data privacy and ethics. And there's legislation, not only at the federal level, but state levels. There's obviously GDPR, and there's new legislation that's either imminent or being considered all around not only the country, but around the world. So, again, this is a massive topic, but can you just give a quick snapshot about how you address that as the leader of both the HR technology ecosystem and people analytics?
Yeah. So first off, that's again one of the areas of many that I don't try to do all on my own. I rely on a lot of good partners, in across HR in the legal space to help make sure we're getting that right and we're adjusting where we need to, but we're also not losing sight over our own philosophy and vision for what we want from a data privacy protection standpoint. So, the short answer there is it takes a whole lot of collaboration and conversation and understanding. And it's one of those things that I don't think ever will it won't ever stop, and maybe that comes across in a negative way, but I think that's right. I'm a huge believer in data privacy, data protection. I don't know that people are gonna disagree with that statement, so perhaps it goes without saying, but I do think that part of our role in people that touch data in some form or fashion is to be good data stewards, data owners of the sometimes sensitive, confidential information that we have. Abide by obviously all the legal regulations that are in place, but also doing what's right by the employee, by the worker in general, regardless of what a legislative piece of regulation says. So I think there's always a lot to consider, and it's again one of those things where I probably on at least one call a week talking through those types of challenges and issues and how we want to think about it and what the future looks like, what adjustments we need to make. So it's a team effort there.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because one of the questions I had was, the frequency. And so, once a week, because you're right, so much is changing and it's hard for any one person to stay on top of. And it is going to impact what we can do in the future, both in terms of constraints, but also in additional possibilities, because data is being created, all the time. So with that, what are your hopes for the future? I mean, where do you see coming next? Not only there at Northwestern Mutual, but in our space in general.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. The things that I'm most excited about, and some of this is perhaps a little bit selfish. I think there's maybe two things. One is a bit more selfish than the other, but the first piece is just around the skills economy, and really how do we understand and leverage the skills that individuals have, the skills that are needed for certain opportunities, and do matching based on that and present the right opportunities and upskill where needed. And I know a lot of organizations are in the midst of that journey currently, and some are further ahead than others. NM is on that journey as well, and I think it's a really exciting thing that's going to be no doubt a multi-year journey to really get to where I think we want to be. But I'm really excited about that type of opportunity that's ahead of us, because I think that's cliche, but it's a game changer for organizations and for employees to be able to leverage that power and that information to find their next opportunity, to find stretch assignments, to promote learning, and really understand what are the requirements that are needed if I want to be, chief whatever one day. Here's how I can get there. Here's different paths. Here's learning opportunities. Here are the skills I need to develop. Here's where I'm falling short. And I think, there's a lot that can go into that. I think there's human elements around just, feedback and coaching that won't ever be replaced by technology or data. So it's, not a Terminator type of world where we're replaced by robots. But I think that's a really exciting direction. And then the other, again, that I'm personally really excited about, that I see a shifting tide in, is really just, it's a little bit of the future of work, and specifically around where, how, what work looks like. We've seen over the last even short while here, and certainly zooming out over the last, decade, 2 decades, a shift in how people approach work and what work means, and, logging in at 8 and taking an hour lunch break and then clocking out at 5, and really shifting to a more flexible style of work, and, adhering a whole lot less to, a 9 to 5 Monday through Friday. And what does that future look like? And where does data, where does technology fit into all of that? I think is really exciting. And there's probably, again, another 3-hour conversation we could have at least on what that world could look like, or possible directions, and why it excites me so much. But that's one that I think from a generational standpoint, I think is really going to continue to shift, and it's going to look very different 5, 10, certainly 20 years from now, that we'll kind of look back on, this time and certainly before. And I think really kind of scratch our heads as to, why it looked the way that it did. So I think that's exciting, just thinking about what the future holds there.
Well, considering I run a company called People on Its Future Work, I certainly celebrate what you shared there. And I couldn't agree more. And it takes, what I get frustrated on is particularly people who have been around for a while. And this is not a criticism, it's just an observation. It's like, hey, I've been there, I've done that. I know human behavior. I know, and it's just not the case. It's that, we have different environments, and we, as human beings, adapt to those environments, and we do so in different ways. And there's different constraints and enablers all over the place. So we have to continually study these dynamics. And so, I certainly celebrate what you said, both on that front and the skills front, because again, they're not mutually exclusive. So, all right. Well, Brad, again, we can talk all day, and I'm just so happy that you've joined me today. So you ready for these rapid fire questions, my friend?
Yeah, I'm ready. Let's do it.
Okay, so first one, what are recent, and they can be from a while back, but what are the books or authors or those who have inspired you? Who comes to mind?
Yeah, so I will tell you, I should have been more prepared for this question. One of the things that doesn't compute in my head so well is authors and who's writing what. I read a ton, both short articles online as well as books. I think there's a lot so short answer is I won't call out authors because I can't name
or podcasts or whatever.
Yeah, but I think there's a lot in the behavioral economics space that I'm really intrigued by. I think, Freakonomics is kind of the cornerstone of that, but there's been a lot more recent books. That's one of those things where, I probably read not nearly as much as I would like to, but, 12, 15 books a year, and over half of them are probably behavioral economics. I think, the two that I read probably most recently are Nudge and Misbehaving, which are both kind of behavioral economics books, and help kind of understand decisions that people make and perhaps why they make those decisions. So, without naming authors, that's probably the genre that I'm most interested in.
Well, if you can't see me, but I'm looking behind me, see if I can find Nudge and give you a an author. But no, thank you for that. That's great. And just for the record, I'm in the same genre as you. So thank you for sharing. Using the word genre again, what is your go-to genre of music?
So I'm a big kind of 2000s, maybe 90s rock guy. So a lot of Dave Matthews is kind of my favorite. So I'm still, for a lot of people I know, it kind of, they grew out of that phase of their life in, high school or in their 20s and stopped paying attention there. For me, I still go to his concerts from time to time, still listen to his music. So I'm a big fan of Dave Matthews. A lot of like Kings of Leon is a favorite of mine, go to right now that, is maybe more than a flavor of the month because it's had a bit of longevity for me, but a bit more transient than, probably Dave Matthews, who's my favorite there.
No, I love both bands, or Dave Matthews, obviously, as a solo artist, but he has the band behind me. What's his band? Do you remember? I don't remember.
It's just Dave Matthews Band, yeah.
They've been a band.
Yeah.
I came back from Russia in 2000, and I believe he had a concert in San Francisco. I'm like, who is this guy? I have no idea who this guy is. I spent 5 years overseas, and I'm like, okay, he's taking over the world. So no, yeah. He's great. So the last question, what do you do for fun?
So maybe I'll give you two answers there. So my wife and I had our firstborn. She's now 18 months old. So a lot of it is just hanging out with her, interacting, and keeping her as entertained as possible. So that certainly gives me joy and is one of the things that I, as much as I love work, I'm always happy. Most of the time, I shouldn't say always, most of the time happy to step away from work and spend time with her, assuming she's not in a fussy mood or anything. But really, it's been, a relatively small sample size of just 18 months there, but has been a great experience and one that definitely brings me a lot of joy outside of work. And then the second thing that I love to do is just run. I like to go for runs. I went for one this morning, and it's a great way to just, I don't know that I would describe it as necessarily fun, because in the moment it doesn't always feel fun, but it helps me kind of think through my thoughts. I get to listen to music and kind of work through whatever is going on in my head and helps me kind of unwind a little bit. So it's a little bit of a de-stressor. It doesn't necessarily, again, wouldn't describe it maybe as fun always, but it's definitely one of the things that I like to do that helps me, get rid of stress, get rid of anxiety, work through challenges, see things from a different perspective. So always like going on a quick run from time to time.
Well, it's a wonderful thing to do. And you stay healthy and keep running because I geek out on it. It's like, you're running down the road, get a little wind in your face, sun on your face, and get your heart pumping. It's a good thing to do. So certainly celebrating our bodies and what we can do as human beings. So, hey, Brad, I want to thank you. Super insightful and enjoyable discussion. Thank you for sharing with me. Thank you for sharing with our audience. How can people learn more about you and what you're up to?
Yeah, so the best way is probably the traditional way through LinkedIn. I'll be honest, I'm not the most active poster. It's one of the things that I would like to lean a little bit more into, but it's one of the things that I'm always on. And doing a whole lot of reading, connecting with folks. So if people do want to connect or reach out, LinkedIn's a great way to do so. I think I'm under Bradford Williams. So you can find me there, and happy to connect and talk through things. I always love doing so.
All right. Outstanding, Brad. Again, super appreciate you, and hope to see you there in Big D before too long.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening today. If you want to learn more about today's guest, go to pafal.net. You'll be able to see links to the bio as well as to the video of today's program. You'll also have the chance to support this podcast and other shows that we do by becoming a PAFAL community member. You can also donate if you choose. What will be helpful to support PAFAL, the People Data for Good movement, and me will be to share this episode with friends, coworkers, and others who might find it valuable. Finally, for updates on upcoming episodes, shows, and events, please subscribe to our newsletter at pafal.net. At the bottom, you can also see our social media presence. So please subscribe to our company page on LinkedIn, follow us on YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. We're active as can be, and we want to provide this content to you that is timely, relevant, and actionable. So again, thank you for listening today, and hope to see you soon. I also want to give a shout out to Jenna Dern, Malaz El Sheikh, and Sarah Sparnan, who without them, this show would not happen. And now go out and make some great things happen.